Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the grizzled 1890s prospector offering you bountiful riches if you complete his one mysterious but intriguing quest.
That's excellent. Yeah, Trent Hergenrader. I would love to be that.
It does sound pretty nice. Run off into the mountains, leave us all behind.
Yep. Reminds me of that, the third short in...
Buster Scruggs.
Buster Scruggs, yeah.
Buster Scruggs. That was a good... I liked that one.
I did too. I watched it again, and it's just as good. The whole thing is good.
Yeah. All right, well, this week we're diving into the realm of environmental and emergent storytelling. So that prospector idea is not completely out the window. We could pursue that and have your own emergent story come out of it.
Yep.
Yeah, from Fallout to Dark Souls, Disco Elysium to Breath of the Wild, there are so many different environments that can tell us something about the history of these places. And interestingly, we're going to start in the real world with Trent diving into his thoughts about how real history and archaeology map to the kinds of emergent environmental storytelling we see in video, board, and role-playing games. So Trent, why don't you lead us in with a little bit of background about the archaeology of exploring historical landmarks?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Stephen, for the excellent introduction today. I actually wanted to start with some definitions. So, we're talking about environmental storytelling and emergent storytelling. Right off the bat, get a couple cites, as my undergrads will often say, citations for these. So the things that got me really thinking about this when I was in graduate school was there's one essay by Henry Jenkins. He's written a couple, but Game Design is Narrative Architecture, which you can find on his own website, was one that really started getting me thinking. And then he refers to these short essays written by a guy named Don Carson, who was a theme park designer. And they're called Environmental Storytelling, Creating Immersive 3D Worlds Using Lessons Learned from the Theme Park Industry. And the reason why I find this so interesting is because when we're talking about creating environments and like of all of our world building stuff, right, the idea is you try and capture the social forces, which are all sort of invisible, that are at play in the world, and then you decide how that affects the people who are in the world, right? So if there's inequality in terms of gender, or if there's huge wealth disparity, or, the military is really strong, what do you sort of see in those environments, or if those are the pressures, what is it that you would physically see in that environment? And that's the part that I think is really quite interesting, is that works for environmental storytelling in terms of how do you want to build a game like Dark Souls or The Witcher or whatever, in which environmental storytelling is a huge part of it. But it's also very much the way that we experience the world if we are willing to sort of inject some complexity into it. So I'll read this little quote from Don Carson cited in the Henry Jenkins essay. When he is describing environmental storytelling, the story element is infused into the physical space a guest walks or rides through. It is the physical space that does much of the work of conveying the story the designers are trying to tell. Armed only with their own knowledge of the world and those visions collected from the movies and books, the audience is ripe to be dropped into your adventure. The trick is to play on those memories and expectations to heighten the thrill of venturing into your created universe, which I think is a nice little quote in and of itself for fictional worlds. And this is where, if you keep reading this, right, when you go to Pirates of the Caribbean, there is no question. Everything in that ride is loaded up from the minute that you get into line until the minute that you get out. Everything is pirate themed. Everything is just saturated with pirate themes. And then you go next door to Jungle Boat Cruise, right? And everything is saturated with African safari. And then you move over, so that's the whole idea, is that each of these little areas are absolutely saturated. And then the emergent storytelling part it's a little bit different from a roller coaster, more for a role-playing game or a digital game, is that you draw from the environment, and then you assemble whatever narrative you want to, and this is, a game in which is, we like big sandbox games where you're playing like Fallout or whatever. Like, yeah, you're going to, even if you complete all of the missions, you complete them in different order than your friends and other players on the internet. So then, that story that you are telling is emerging from your decisions and emerging from what you come across and the chronology in which you sort of come across those. The reason why I think this is so interesting to look back on is, as I've talked about before on the podcast, I've taken students to Spain, where we go to the south of Spain, Andalusia, and we check out all of these sites of the old Muslim kingdom of Al-Andalus. And one of the things that we talk about is how the history there is pretty much written into the geography. And it's like that everywhere. I think the reason, and I mean, that's one of the points, is that it's like that absolutely everywhere. You just need to train your eyes to look for it, right? So this is where when we're walking through, for example, Madrid, that doesn't have a whole lot left. A lot of the memories of Al-Andalus have been erased from Madrid and Toledo. There's some that still remain, but not nearly as evident as they are in places like Sevilla, Cordoba, and Granada. But the whole point is that there's there's an El Corte Inglés right next door, right? And it's like, okay, well, this building has been here for X number of years, and this building has been here for X number of centuries, right? And they exist in our moment, this whole flattening of history. They exist in the same time and space in this exact moment. And you need to be able to like peel back the years and be like, I wonder when this sort of happened, right? And this is where what you get, especially in a city like Madrid that was destroyed in, or large parts of it were destroyed during the Spanish Civil War. You've got very old construction next to relatively new construction, right? And then in certain places, like in London as well, I know they've torn down some, row houses or whatever and put up a big fancy new shiny building. And it's like, okay, well, that sticks out. Everything else around there is sort of a 19th century, early 19th century architecture. But then this place, sticks out as something that is definitely 21st century. So I thought we could talk about that a little bit, about just both these ideas of how you saturate an environment with a genre, right? And this is also where, most spaces that we move through are not being designed in that way. They just exist in that way. Like if you're traveling through the American South, or the South of the United States, much more Civil War sort of monuments and memories of Confederate generals, and all those other kind of things. And it's like, okay, well, the fact that those are inscribed into the geography tells you something about the culture, at least what part of the culture values, right? Like if they didn't value it, they would tear it down or they would build over it. And that's one of the things too that's always fun when we do these trips to Portugal and Spain. Up at the top, they tore down the church and they tore down the castle, but then they didn't want to lug new building blocks up there, so they just repurposed them, right? So it's like, oh, you can see that there are these inscriptions, and then it's like, oh, and then the Muslims took it back over, they ripped it down and put up a mosque, and then they ripped it back down and turned it back, and and it's like it just keeps going around and around. And the fact that when we come across anything in the world, right, at any point, like you can ask yourself, how long has it been that way? So if you're backpacking in, the deep parts of Yellowstone or whatever, it's like, oh, it's probably been pretty much like this forever, or for, what I mean, since before human history. Whereas if you go to some place like Seattle, it's like, or the joke in Steve Martin's movie LA Story, when he's showing somebody around LA, he's like, some of these buildings are 70 years old, right? And it's like not at all, going back to Rome or Greece or something like that, thinking about how long that those sort of structures have been there, but then also how modern Greeks and modern Romans live with that all around them all the time.
As soon as you started talking about the ways that, especially in the American South, you can see the construction of a narrative, I immediately thought of Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, which is all about the history of slavery in the United States. And he specifically looks at how preservative structures within American societies, like monuments and road names and neighborhoods, reflect these conflicting foundational truths about what the past is.
Yeah.
And that the past is never one thing. It's always all different kinds of things that get flattened out into what we call a fact about history. This would have been completely relevant in our conversation about America on July 4th as well. Like the entire book really focuses on societal perception and how rewriting history happens through environmental storytelling.
Yeah.
I also think that this is deeply interconnected with the way games are designed. And as somebody who previously was teaching game designers about some of these things, what I used to tell them, and I did a presentation on this for the University of Connecticut Game Design Club a number of years ago. I pulled it up, and one of the things that I had told them was a fixed narrative is one that operates on a rail system. So the audience might have some agency with respect to superficial elements of the experience, like their character's movement or combat, but that's definitely different than a narrative that is more complex and built on the interaction of systems you don't directly control. So in the context of something like Fallout or Skyrim, there are set pieces where you see some skeletons huddled in a corner or in a bathtub, and it tells you something about that environment or what it was like when the nuclear bomb went off. That's a form of environmental storytelling. the emergent narrative that is associated with that is you as the player discovering that thing in the environment and then making sense of it in the context of your character's particular journey through that world. So these two things are interconnected. If you look at the book and the chapter, we talked about writing catalog entries for people, places, things, events, groups. That's a place where you can do a lot of this instructional world building, that you can ask your learners to build out a world that communicates its values or its history or conflicting values in history by virtue of the kinds of things in the catalog. And when we talked about that in the book and when we've talked about it in the podcast, that's almost entirely in the context of vocabulary or text. But I often had art students who would do this with illustrations or mood boards or other forms of expression that could accomplish something similar. And I know you had done a project relatively recently with some of your students where you gave them artwork or examples of a sort of futuristic apocalyptic world where we don't know exactly how it got that way, but maybe there's some technology intergrown with the physical environment, the natural environment, that can be a really powerful mechanism for getting someone to feel a certain way about what an environment is or make some interpretations. The first thing that makes me think of something like Shadow of the Colossus, which as a game, you don't really know what happened in that world. You only see the colossi. And it's quite similar to something like Dark Souls or Demon Souls or Elden Ring, where these environments are supposed to have existed for thousands and thousands of years. And you as the player are only seeing that cross section that's been cut like an archaeological dig or like an ice core from Antarctica, where you're picking out little pieces of information that are embedded in flavor text or in something like the skeletons in the bathtub. All of that is giving you a little bit of a hint of what that world might have been like in the past for somebody else. One of the things that's most rewarding about those kinds of games is that it makes you feel smaller as a player. It kind of, I don't want to say it eliminates the power fantasy element of it, because obviously Skyrim and Fallout have power fantasies associated with them, but it makes you feel like one smaller piece of a much bigger reality in which you only have the ability to affect a little bit of that world, and the rest of the time you're an adventurer or somebody journeying through that world as a kind of discovery learner. You're finding things in the environment, making sense of it, and the takeaway is really all about you telling the story of adventuring through that world, not you creating the world for somebody else to then interpret.
Yeah. No, it makes me think too, as you were talking, that I went to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico over my school spring break this past March, and we went to Chichen Itza, and we also went to some ruins in Tulum. These are Mayan ruins. I've also been to Greece, went to Athens, went out to Cape Sunion, where there's an amazing temple to Poseidon there. And when I'm walking around Chichen Itza and when I'm walking around Tulum, I'm like, why has this never come up in our history books growing up? You know what I mean? It's like, oh, ancient Rome and ancient Greece and whatever. These societies were quite obviously very advanced and knew mathematics and knew all of this stuff. But it's just like, oh, well, no, they were savages because that's the way that we received that story, right? And it's like they were nowhere near as advanced as the Greeks. They were nowhere near as advanced as Europeans. And it's like, that seems like they couldn't have built these amazing monuments, to their culture and to their belief systems had they not had a little bit of wherewithal. This is especially, for the history of the peoples in North America. I've been reading over the years or whatever, but it's like, oh, well, if you're building things mostly out of wood and natural materials, those do not preserve for thousands upon thousands of years. They degrade and then they turn to dust, right? There is nothing to find. So it's not that these people have no history, they have no culture, they have none of these things. It's that they're using, non-permanent or, things that erode. And there is no, and I think this is one of the things that makes it really hard to sort of like engage with history in that same way, is we know all of the Caesars, right? All of their names and their personalities, and all those things. And we just don't have that historical record. And it's very easy to then pretend that one doesn't exist. Like that blank record must be blank. It's not that it is, we don't know anything about it. It's that because there is no permanent mark left on the land that we can't sort of recognize that anything once stood here. It's a weird mental gymnastics that we go through to decide. And then also, like, when you come up on something, when do you decide to bulldoze it? Is it encroaching or is it culture who comes along something else? When do you decide you're going to bulldoze it? When do you decide that you're going to build around it? When, turn it into a museum, turning into a cultural heritage place? I think it was in Avila outside Madrid as well. in which they've got the town wall, and you can see that some of the stones were headstones that were used in Roman graves. And it's like, well, to us, it's like, how could you dig up a Roman grave? And to them, it's like, here's a perfectly good stone, right? You know, and it's like they're not thinking about it in the same way, because they, you know, it's like, do I lug up a whole bunch of new stone, or do I use what's here right now, right? And that's not even a moral judgment. That's just sort of like what's useful in this moment. I mean, and this is where too, like, you just walk around. Rochester is a great city for this as well, and that it's been completely overhauled multiple times, and there are minuscule things that remain, but it's really fun to be able to walk around and be like, oh yeah, well, you know, the Erie Canal used to come through the middle of downtown right through here. Right now it's a street, but it used to be the Erie Canal, right? And it's like, oh, and now it's a train line, or, you know, whatever those things are. But just that ability, I mean, we were talking before we jumped on about living memory, where I don't remember any times before the Erie Canal, because it's been around before I was alive, right? You know, it's been around before everybody who's alive today so there is no such thing as a living memory of anyone that doesn't include, in this part of the world, the Erie Canal, because the Erie Canal has always been there. But that doesn't mean that it's always been there, right? Like, that was a man-made, you know, quite literally man-made invention, canals in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I find something so liberating about being able to look at history that way and understand that everything is in a constant state of transition from what it was to what it will be, and that it's easy to go moment to moment, think the world as it is right now is how it will forever be. I saw a lot of this when people discussed the demolition of the East Wing of the White House and how it's a travesty. It's ruined this landmark. It's our house. It shouldn't be affected this way by one person's whims, which I think that in some sense is true. Like, one person shouldn't be able to make the decision about whether a historical landmark should be destroyed or preserved. But something I kept thinking to myself is, that's not even the original White House, right? Like, the original one was burned down. And so when we think about what we mean when we say something is a landmark, or that it's a monument to history, or that it's a fixture of our culture, all of that is also interwoven with this idea that narratives are malleable, that they are constantly changing. They don't have to be the way they are now. And we talked about this with both Kevin Balestrini and Roger Travis in terms of the way we all narratize our lives, and that telling the story through the environment around us, yes, you can communicate some very important things about your social systems, your cultural systems, your governmental and economic systems, but decisions will be made along the way by different people with different incentives and different motivations to prioritize different things. And just like you were describing in Spain, you layer one thing on top of another, on top of another, and eventually you end up with this sort of tiramisu of history and the value systems that applied at different eras. Now, if you only have, as you said, the kinds of natural materials that will decay, obviously you won't be able to follow that record all the way back, and we have to do some inventing as to what may have been, or why would something have not been preserved in a particular way. So there isn't necessarily always going to be a time capsule. And that's one thing that I think is interesting with respect to how games are designed, because in some sense, when I was teaching game designers about emergent and environmental storytelling, I was teaching them how to build a time capsule that reflected the values they wanted to communicate to their audiences. So in the real world, that's not typically what happens. As you said earlier on, we're not explicitly going out into the world usually and going and designing an environment to serve this purpose. But in a game, you are almost always trying to communicate some kind of message about your value system. That's why in a game like Fallout, when you find the skeletons, those were put there for a reason. It's not arbitrary. Whereas if you play something like Shadow of Mordor and you are running around all of Tolkien's universe fighting orcs, irrespective of the fixed narrative that's built into that, which I think is not very good. But the emergent narrative that comes out of that is actually quite interesting because of the dynamics of the designed mechanisms for the orcs to remember, quote unquote, your character. And that the story you end up telling, or at least for me, I chose to interpret the game this way. When I played it, it was all about my personal interaction with those NPCs and their remembering me later on when they got into a fight with me and they ran away, and then they come back and we get into another fight and they run away, and I have this arch nemesis that's now roaming around the map with me. And that to me is a much more engaging kind of storytelling than just following the strict linear narrative. And when I previously gave this talk to my game design students, I actually had a diagram I used that sort of created a spectrum between ill-defined emergent games all the way to well-defined fixed narratives. And On the ill-defined side, I included things like Minecraft or Valheim, Lego Worlds, Stardew Valley, even I think would fit that category. Whereas on the well-defined or fixed narrative side, I had things like The Last of Us and BioShock, where they're
Yeah.
very explicitly designed to get you to a specific moment and then use exposition to convince you of a thing, rather than allowing you to explore the environment and make decisions and then watch the environment change around you based on the decisions you've made. So there's obviously a lot of room in between
Yeah.
those things. I think Breath of the Wild is interestingly somewhere kind of in the middle. There's the story of The Legend of Zelda and Link traversing the terrain of Hyrule to go fight Ganon, but also the game is a giant physics engine, and the entire point is to just go out and look at the world and see what's there.
Right.
Nintendo very deliberately tried to design it such that your attention would be drawn to specific environmental artifacts that would either help you understand the world of Hyrule more effectively and or draw your attention so that you'll walk over there and learn something new about the environment on your own. So it wasn't explicitly directive in that you needed to follow the linear line all the way from beginning to end, but it was intentionally designed to get you to explore these places or at least develop curiosity about them,
Yeah.
which would then inform the emergent story that came out of your particular experience with that world.
Right. And I think that's, as you're talking too, I was thinking about a number of different things that I was jotting down. Number one is that, like in Germany too, they left remnants of the Berlin Wall and they left remnants of concentration camps specifically so you won't forget. That's not something that if you erase it from sight, then you erase it from memory. So there's something about saying this is not something we want to celebrate, but we still want to make it visible and part of our environment because it's something that the culture needs to sort of reckon with. And then thinking about, two of my favorite cities in the United States are quite different. Washington, D.C., which is basically planned that way, the National Mall. It is meant to be monuments to our government, monuments to our leaders and all those things. And then New Orleans, which I just love because it's so different than every other city in the country, right? It's like, it's one of those things that I would love to be able to take somebody from, a rural village in, China or somewhere deep in the Amazon or whatever, and be able to walk them through some of these places. Or like even just going from Rochester to Buffalo up to Toronto. And it's like, do you see how the culture changes here? Like maybe you don't. Like people who live here, as soon as you cross over the border, there are things that seem more Canadian. I don't know whether somebody who is like, looking at it and it's all new and different and weird would necessarily see that. But I think that that's where thinking about some of those environments and just thinking about how New Orleans has all of those different swirling cultures and they created their own culture, their Creole culture, but then also, how Washington, D.C. has these monuments that are, a tribute to democracy and all those things. And then Fallout 3 uses that as a basis to sort of have a commentary on, government and whatever. What does it mean to be walking around in a wasteland in which all of your most sacred government monuments are in ruins and inhabited by super mutants, right? And it's like, well, that feels like what 2026 is, right? Like all of our government monuments are filled with super mutants at this point. But that's just, it's a way. The thing that I like is that sort of slipperiness in which environments are generally designed, like very rarely do things just spring up out of absolutely nothing and no one cares about it, right? But it's also where, when we look at the United States and Europe and in places in Latin America and Asia, it's like, okay, well, what were the places that were built in the 17th, 18th, 19th century and were not built for automobile traffic, right? And then you start getting places that were built and developed later into the 20th and, of course, the 21st century, and they're absolutely built for automobile traffic, right? And it's like, oh, well, you ever try and drive in Boston? It's like driving in Boston is a lot more like driving in Rome or something like that with lots of little side streets that, are difficult to navigate, or London or whatever, than it is like driving somewhere in Florida, right? Where it's like, okay, well, long open stretches, or, in Denver or something like that too, where it was a little cow town. And then by the time modernity and the Industrial Revolution caught up, there had been a lot of stuff that had already been developed. So you don't develop those cities without those technologies in mind. And it's a lot of fun to just think about how, number one, those can be captured in the stories that we want to tell, fictional stories that we want to tell, but then also how we can see it if we have a little wherewithal and know a little history to be able to identify those things, because it's just living and breathing everywhere. This is one of the things that we talk about in my world building class too, is like just my office would take a long, long time to go down to every detail of every single thing in it. And it's like, well, any city block in any town, any village, whatever, you could do a lot of that same work. How, like, when did it get to be this way? Who made it this way? What did they decide to be this way? What was here before that? All that kind of good stuff. And it's one of those, I always like to think too about when you dial in, we're always talking about lenses in academia. When you dial that in to looking around the world, it just, to me, fires the imagination with lots of different ways that you can tell your stories. And then when you're building your world, well, yeah, sure, it's a dragon cult, but like, how long has that dragon cult been there? And are there other remnants of previous societies that didn't worship dragons in the same way or whatever? And that's when you can tell that people are really doing the work of world building, where, oh, it's been this way and it's always been this way. Well, it's been this way for maybe 200 years within lived memory, but there was stuff that happened way before that that no one remembers or no one talks about, or maybe they do and they really value it, but you as an outsider, or the narrator as an outsider, has no idea. And that's just where that whole idea that we, go on and on about in the book, that it's like, oh, well, it's an embodied sort of, you embodied in a space, whether that's embodied virtually or physically, right? And in taking in that entire environment, that's sort of the work of world building, is trying to figure out where do you fit in both space and time, and then how do you put it in relation to everything else you know about space and time, right? And it's like, oh, well, that's kind of cognitive overload that you could do going to virtually any place, right? Like any place that have marks of culture and civilization.
I think that's arguably George R. R. Martin's problem as an author, that this gardening approach he takes is that it's just world building, and he's really interested in the history of the world he's created. But the problem is, the more you drill down, the more detail is necessary to explain how did this thing get to be the way that it was. And if you start pulling that thread, suddenly there are a bunch of others that are going to come up with it that you're like, oh, well, I guess this thing also has to be explained, and then we have to explain this. And eventually you end up with this overwhelming amount of information that's going to dictate where you go, and it's just going to be very difficult to carve out one specific plot line from that and follow it from beginning to end if what you're really interested in is the building out of the world behind it. I also thought, as you were talking about the R. Crumb comic, The Short History of America, that we couldn't reprint in the book for reasons we don't need to get into here, but
it was too expensive.
It was too expensive. But one of the reasons why we liked that a lot as a shorthand for what we're describing is because it both depicts the temporal aspect of this as well as the physical aspect of it, that the space and time are captured in each frame of that comic. It also, if you point your students or learners at something like that as an example, it's easier for them to be able to see what happens when you take a snapshot of their world at any given point in time, and get them to articulate, okay, what are the elements of this that are going to be most consistent or stable over time versus those that aren't. If your government is in upheaval, what kinds of things might change about that physical landscape that you're looking at from the beginning to the middle to the end of that society, whatever it's going to be? The same way that in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, you have Old Valyria and its destruction as being a catalyst for the changes that happen in Westeros, and that the world of Westeros looks quite a bit different than the world of Essos, which is across the sea and wasn't affected in quite the same way by the Targaryen family moving in and taking over that continent. So the artifacts of each of those locations through space and time look different because the cultures of Essos are different than the cultures of Westeros, and they don't have quite the same cultural DNA as informed by the collapse of Old Valyria.
Right.
I think maybe that's a little bit too much detail, but the idea being that as you shape a world, whether it's for some explicit educational end or for creative writing purposes or for game design for that matter, I think there's a lot of mileage you can get out of picking one specific area of that world and kind of drilling down and saying, okay, I'm really going to focus on this particular mark of history because even if the rest of the world wasn't affected in the same ways, I'm not in the same way as that initial component. I'm going to find myself overwhelmed by trying to bring together all the pieces in one way that is ultimately going to tell a coherent story. It's the reason why when Martin gets stuck in the Gordian knot or the Myronese knot that he develops, it's just so difficult to get out of, because now you're talking about cultures that are completely disparate from one another. And once Daenerys is stuck there, it's like, okay, where's the momentum to get her back to the other culture? Because these other things in space and time are not really connected anymore.
The lure of endless world building is what I've called that in the past. So that's where it's like, oh, well, of course, everything has, I mean, every character has two parents. Most of them will have siblings. Some of them will have kids. Well, how much do readers or an audience need to know about any of them? And like we could just keep doing that. Your parents have parents. Their parents had parents, right? I mean, like we all came
Right.
here from somewhere, and that's it's one of those things that you really do need to focus when you're moving from. This is one of the things too that I always harp on is that you need to keep your world building separate from your narrative because the narrative is only going to need parts of the world where the world building can go on for absolutely ever, right? Like if you're going to catalog absolutely everything in every corner of every building, well, you'll be here for 10 million years, and then history keeps happening, right? So
Right.
it's an impossible task.
There's also the fact that as you're trying to figure out what your narrative is going to be, I used to tell my students a lot that it was valuable to think about what can you show and not tell, right?
Hmm.
That old adage, show, don't tell, because exposition is only going to get you so far. You're only going to be able to tell the audience so much before they tune out or before it becomes, like we were saying, too overwhelming. So what can you seed into the world that may itself have some kind of narrative value, but isn't going to require you to put dialogue behind it?
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I think that the Bethesda games are quite good at this, is that they very deliberately choose to tell little micro stories in the environments as opposed to feeling like every single story needs to be told in a notebook you find with the
Right.
dialogue written into
Right.
it, right?
Yeah.
Taking advantage of that, I mean, this really requires people who I think are good artists, right? Environmental artists, character artists, etc., who can seed this material in there for somebody to find. If you create a world that doesn't have that stuff, it's going to feel very hollow. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of open world games don't feel particularly open, or maybe they feel too open without enough focus, is
Right.
because it's easy to create a landscape that is big. It's a lot different to create a big landscape that has interesting details associated with it. But the more detail you add, the more complicated it becomes to thread all the pieces together, which is, again, why I mentioned Breath of the Wild, where
Right.
a lot of the things you're discovering aren't necessarily quote unquote narrative in a traditional storytelling sense. They are designed for you as the player to discover and act on, and the narrative depends on you telling that story, not the game designer. They
Right.
were very, very, very smart in terms of figuring out how do we get you to use the physicality of this world to solve a problem to find a Korok.
Hmm.
That's not about
Hmm.
the Korok's history and its parentage and its
Yeah.
lineage, right?
Yeah.
It's about how do you take this environment and do something with it that's interesting that then you can go tell your friends about, or that will differentiate your playthrough from somebody else's. There's a lot of criticism lobbed at Ubisoft for the way that it approaches open world game
Hmm.
design, and it has too much information, right? There's too much information. The minimap is covered in little icons.
Yeah.
Everything feels like it's equally important, and when everything is equally important, nothing is
Nothing is.
important.
Yep.
So there is this really fine line you have to walk. If I can extend this to one additional example, I think Black Myth Wukong was for me a really interesting approach to Eastern storytelling as opposed to Western storytelling.
Hmm.
I don't know a lot of Eastern folklore. And so for me to play that, I could only really figure out what was going on based on the environmental context. But often that was enough for me to get the gist of
Yeah.
whether this is a good omen or a bad omen, whether this was a good place or a bad place, and what are the different characters' motivations. All of those things could be communicated without directly telling me this is what I'm trying to achieve as the designer. I think that that model ends up being much more effective. It's one of the reasons I love FromSoft games too. They're just giving you more opportunity to explore the world without making it mandatory that you
Yeah.
explore every aspect of the world to be able to follow what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, that is also much more like the way that our world is built, right? Where it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
lots of different people for lots of different reasons, whether they're well planned out or whether it's just a decision in the moment. That's how our world builds and grows, right? But when you're building a video game, it's like, oh, well, in Grand Theft Auto, if it were real, you could stop and talk to every single pedestrian. But
Right. Yeah.
you don't want to talk to every pedestrian. I mean, that's what's the point of that. Like, just like you could stop anybody at the mall and get their 2 cents. And it's like, well, unless you're giving a survey or something like that, there's no point in having that level of detail. And one of the things too that I've been meaning forever to sort of like look into a little bit and try and do a little bit more of a study to figure out whether it's just me or whether this is something that other people have experienced too. But the CD Projekt Red games for both Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, I didn't have a lot of experience with either one of those worlds and kind of bounced off them a little bit. Like just, like they're fine, they're fun, and I can see there's all these pathways, and yes, there's environmental storytelling that's sort of sewn in or whatever. But once for The Witcher, once I started reading the short stories and then started reading the novels and watching the TV show, it really, like when I went back to play it, I'm like, I get it now. Like everything makes so much more sense. And to a lesser extent, that same thing was happening with Cyberpunk 2077, is that I watched the TV show Cyberpunk Edge Runners, read a little bit more of the history in the big tabletop role-playing game book, read a graphic novel or whatever, and it's like, now I get it a little bit, right? So then the question, I would think too about if you've got a Star Wars game, how much are you leveraging that environment and that environmental storytelling for people who are deeply familiar with Star Wars lore, or are you making it for a first-timer, or are you trying to make it to a general audience, or your mileage may vary the more sort of lore that you know, and it's the same thing for whatever the next what Skyrim was Elder Scrolls 5, right? And it's like you can go back and they do have traces that go back to all through all the different Elder Scrolls that if you've not played them, who cares? And if you have played them, it's just kind of like a nice little bonus, like an Easter egg or whatever. And I think that's where for all this stuff with game design, environmental design, fiction writing, making a movie or whatever, it all comes down to those individual decisions of what you're going to emphasize and what you're going to either ignore or have in the background or whatever. And every single one of those decisions has some impact. The stuff that sticks out in your head are the ones in which more of that stuff pays off than other stuff, right? And it's like if you've got an environment that's littered with just random stuff, same thing if you're looking in Fallout, like that's where I would, I'd say, okay, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I got to go to bed. I'm just going to go look through this last warehouse, right? I'm just going to look through every room in this warehouse. I'm just going to look through every filing cabinet and every desk in this warehouse, right? And it's like, and even that, there's plenty of stuff when people say, oh, you can do anything you want in Skyrim or anything you want in Fallout, and you can't, right? There's plenty of stuff. If you want to knock over a filing cabinet, you can't do that, right? There's no mechanics for you to be able to do that. But that's not to say there isn't a tremendous amount of stuff that you can explore, and whatever. And I always think, oh, well, what if this is the filing cabinet that's going to have, an awesome rocket launcher? And it never is. It just has a couple bottle caps and a clipboard, right? It's like, okay, but, there's still just that appeal. And I think that that's a sign of really compelling environmental storytelling as well, is that you want to look through all of those things. You want to turn every stone over to figure out what might you be missing, because sometimes you turn something over and it's like, whoa, there's a whole cavern here, right? That I'm gonna whole rabbit hole that I get to go explore. And I think that that's one of the things that, for being a good world builder and for thinking, it's even about history, it's about narratives that describe our historical reality as well. How do you identify the story that you want to tell and build the environment around it? Because everything all the time is too much, right? So there's always this process of clearing away. I often talk about this when we're doing story jam kind of stuff. Brainstorm, and then start clearing away, because if you don't clear away, it's just going to be a muddled mess, like my desktop, right? Like it's that same kind of thing. You could walk into somebody else's house, their desktop is super messy. Well, you sit down at my desk, I know where everything is, right? But to somebody who doesn't know, it just looks like a complete cluttered mess. So maybe that's a tangent that doesn't make any sense. But I think that all of those things are both about how to tell good stories and how to curate a space, for storytelling and for players to find their own stories to tell. But then when we're thinking about historical moments, right, I think it's really, this is kind of what we talk about in the book. Let's talk about the stories of the people who lived in that world, London in the 14th century, or what would it have looked like? What would have been there? How many people would have been there? How many animals would have been there? Would the roads have been paved? What would it have smelled like? All that kind of stuff. Going into that level of detail, I think, really helps put you in that mindset that it's like, well, we all know London was this big major city, but it wasn't always, you know what I mean? And like, you could very easily rewind in time to the place in which it's like, no, that was just the public market. You know what I mean? And it really wasn't that much bigger than anywhere else. And then at a certain point, it hits it and gets super huge. Or like, using Spain too. Cordoba was the biggest city in all of Europe. At its height, it was bigger than London and more important than Paris and whatever. And now it's like the 6th or 7th biggest city in Spain, right? It's like, it's tiny, but that doesn't mean back in the day that it wasn't huge and important, and all those kind of things. But you need to be able to read tea leaves, or at least the strata in the environment, right? To be able to see what was built, destroyed, built over, all that kind of stuff, to get a sense of it was a big deal back then.
As you're describing that, I think about the purposefulness of how you're evaluating those strata. What is it you're trying to look for when you go back and review the history of a place? As you're describing the desk, I thought of synaptic pruning and the idea that brains do this automatically, as outdated or irrelevant information starts to naturally decay or become less useful over time, your brain will go through and reduce the number of redundant neural connections that exist so that it can focus on the stuff that matters.
Yep.
And there's actually a corollary here too, where to your point about the desk being covered in clutter, being a hoarder of information is not necessarily a good way to be able to evaluate and utilize information. So if you have newspapers dating back 100 years and you have one for every day, is that as useful as having the newspapers that had really important events in them? Is that the same or different than the way you synaptically prune memories? Like, do you need to know what you had for breakfast 3 years ago on a Tuesday morning? Yep. Or is there a particular breakfast that was really important because it was with your mother or it was with some famous person or you had some other kind of thing happen to you, right? That there are these other elements that make a moment worth remembering as opposed to just dump it in the pile and somebody someday will sort through it, which I think is sort of the misconception a lot of people who struggle with hoarding and collecting, like, because they assume it's all equally valuable. And in some cases it is. Like, if you have hyperconnectivity and you really do have persistent memory about all of these different things, there comes a tipping point where the utility of that starts to diminish and the excess starts to get in the way of the things that are actually more important. And that's kind of how I think about world building too. Like, if you are doing that accumulation, that hoarding of information about the world, you're not really doing yourself any favors because you're minimizing the impact of all the stuff that could otherwise be important or attention grabbing, which is exactly why Fallout doesn't let you do everything that you want to do. They know that if you created an environment that really was fully maximally interrogable in the way that the real world is, people could fall down a rabbit hole and get stuck there and stay there the entire time while never actually getting to the point of the game.
The point of it, yeah, exactly. Because that's where, you could walk around your house and do the same thing. Like, yeah, I could push over any bookshelf in my house, but I don't do it because it's going to create a mess, right? So it's like, well, there's, the ways that we sort of navigate those environments. But I was gonna put on my English professor hat for a second and say, Jorge Luis Borges has a story called Funes the Memoriam, and it's about a guy who remembers everything. And it's basically, the whole point is, it's basically a torture, right? Like, the guy can't forget anything, and then therefore is completely incapable of getting anything done because his brain is just too full of every memory he's ever had. And then the other one is Georges Perec, who wrote a bunch of essays. He was a French essayist, middle part of the 1960s in France, I believe. But he would have all these essays about every item that was on his desk and where it came from and how it got there, or like he did have an essay in which he wrote for a year, he wrote down absolutely everything that he ate, and he just presented that with no sort of other information, right? Like you will be able to glean whatever conclusions you want or draw whatever conclusions you want from this list of everything that I ate or drank from a year, right? And that's kind of the same idea. It's like it's kind of an environmental storytelling approach to biography, right? Not autobiography, but to biography. It's like, what would you be able to say about this person if you knew everything that they ate, or every TV show that they watched, or every movie, or everything that they read, or every website history, right? You would be, even without knowing them, you'd be able to make some sort of guess as to what they're into. Are they into pop culture, reality TV, whatever it is? That question, the haunting one, is always, at what point is it too much? And that's where I would say the things like Georges Perec talking about all the things that he ate in a year or all the things on his desk, that is the same as world building, in which you are presenting a bunch of stuff, right? For somebody else to then sort through and figure out, they're going to draw their own conclusions or whatever. But if you're writing a short story or a novel or making a game, well, you've got a narrative arc that you're trying to lead. I mean, oftentimes, Minecraft doesn't really have a narrative arc, but you're trying to create a narrative arc for a storytelling game in which you're propelling people forward. And in that environment, you do need to have those clues about what's important and what is not, what is worth touching, what is worth, avoiding or whatever. And then, you think about all the different clues. This is one of the things, too, that in game design, it's like, oh, well, do you put a slight orange halo around anything you can interact with, right? Or do you have like the investigate mode where you right click a button and everything that you can interact with glows a little bit? So it does give you that sense of like an immersive, saturated environment with some mechanic to be able to have you separate the wheat through the chaff. So, but I think that's the point that I'm trying to make here is it's very difficult to, as an artist, to figure out what stays and what goes. And ultimately, like you were just saying, I feel like a lot of people just think more and more and more and more and more is the answer. And it totally isn't, right? It's
Right.
if it were that easy, then and that's where it's like, oh, I'm getting so excited because I just realized that this tax code would have had to be based on, this thing in the history, and there must have been this millionaire who was greasing this politician, and it's like, okay, like if that's the story you want to tell, this is time well spent. But if you want to tell a story that's way over here, just hand wave that stuff, right? Like I'm sure that probably
Right.
happened, but you don't need to be the one to explain it all because everything as you have a deeper explanation is just going to, like you were saying with George R. R. Martin, you just dig up more things that then need to be explained. And I think this is where lots of people feel like they're writing, or they're doing the business. And it's like, if that's all you want to do, that's fine. But if you want to tell a story, then you need to be able to know. And then if you want a story that's going to appeal to audiences who don't know all of that history, how do you bring them through in a way that is engaging, what is optional, what is mandatory, all that kind of good stuff.
It's the strategy, right? The
Yeah.
strategic implementation of this stuff. Because to your point, I think it's fine. If my students wanted to sit there and create catalog entries for literally everything in their world, okay, but think about the trade-offs you're making, right?
Yeah.
You are not creating things that are more deliberate. And frankly, if you're the educator who's using world building in a classroom, you don't want students focused on extraneous nonsense because obviously there's a learning objective
Yep.
associated with this activity. So the further and further you get from the learning objective, the less and less likely it is that the learner will ever stumble upon it. And if they don't stumble upon it, they're not going to interrogate it, they're not going to reflect on it, and it's not going to be transferable, which then leaves everybody wondering what was the point of doing the exercise in the first place. So
Yep.
I usually would try to nudge them toward, okay, this is a good observation. That's an interesting question, but let's return to the more targeted, this is what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah.
Specifically, I'm thinking about the story I had shared previously, my students who found the jar of noses, and that was going to
Yeah.
become the central MacGuffin for the story they were telling. And it's like, okay, great, you have a jar of noses now. That's a weird
Yeah.
thing I didn't expect was going to be there. But now we don't have to talk about the ladles and the soup spoon and the
Yeah.
bowl and the sink. Like all of those things can kind of be hand waved as it's a kitchen, right? We know
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
kitchen.
Exactly.
And you don't have let the and maybe this is actually part of the strategy too, is that you want to leverage individuals' imaginations in a way that they can just fill in those gaps for themselves because there's not really a lot of mileage to be gained out of explaining a thing that they're interacting with on a daily basis personally anyway, right?
Right.
You're just,
Right.
what is the utility of explaining what a soup spoon is to somebody if you can be putting that time and energy into something else in
Exactly.
the environment they probably wouldn't have ever seen or interrogated before?
Yeah, that's like I say that too when we're doing items in world building. I'm like, if it's a broom and your description is it's a long wooden stick with some bristles at the end that someone shoves around the floor to clean up dust, it's like, yeah, I know what a broom is, right? You know what I mean? Like I don't need a wiki, and it's like, oh, I'm having a hard time getting, 150 or 250 words to describe it. I'm like, because dude, it's a broom, and everybody knows what it does, right? Like if it's a rocket powered broom, or if it's a broom of poison identity or something like that, well, that's interesting. That would, but you don't need to describe. And I was thinking too, as you were talking, that like one of my favorite, we were playing. This was in high school, playing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles role playing game. This was like their mission where someone found them and they were getting them out into the world. They weren't Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They were like some other species. I can't remember what they were. But the idea, I had this map of this house, sort of like the X-Men mansion or whatever, this big place where they were being trained. And I remember the ninjas were coming through, whatever, to get them. And one of my players asked, oh, like, so this is the kitchen, right? And I said, yeah. And he's like, oh, well, I'm assuming there's got to be pots and pans. And I'm like, well, yeah. He's like, oh, well, I reach in and I grab a pot and I, throw a pot at one of the ninjas. And I like gave him a little extra bonus XP for that because I'm like, yeah, that's the thing is you don't need to say a kitchen is going to have knives and pots and a stove because we know what's in a kitchen, right? If your player chooses, in that particular case, if the player chooses to interact with that environment, well, then yeah, roll with it. I mean, quite literally roll with it, but also figuratively, like, yeah, if that makes sense, then would there be a bazooka in the kitchen? Probably not, but a butcher knife, sure, right? Why wouldn't there be? I was thinking
There,
too, like as you were talking, you got somebody I was going to talk about another
that's fine.
place. Okay, I'd only been to Spain once or twice, I think, before I'd been to taking this trip in Portugal, and then I did the north of Spain and went past this place. There was this area in Asturias, which is way in the not in the northern and sort of northwestern area of Spain, that there were cars that were stopped. It was some holiday, people were going up, right, and then would drive in and I, say to somebody, well, what is this, right? And it was a place called Covadonga, in which it's like, oh, it's some place where some Christians beat some Muslims in some battle, and now it's got some great. And it's like, okay, well, we don't want to park 3 miles away, so let's just keep going, right? And it's like, well, many years later, when I started doing more in the study of history of southern Spain and the Reconquista, or the original building of Al-Andalus and the Reconquista, well, it turns out that that is the spot at which the Christians finally like turned back the encroaching Muslims, right? So it's like that's their Bunker Hill, or that would be their Gettysburg, or whatever it is. But I had no idea, right? So it's like, we'll just keep driving. And it was one of those things that once I knew that history, I'm like, oh, I would have really liked to see that spot where, the history, and I mean, it's also the history that you like to tell. I think it's the actual history is a little bit, people say that's where the Reconquista started and then lasted, over hundreds of years or whatever. But it's one of those things in which if you don't know the broader history contextually, what that history means, then it just kind of leaves you flat, and it's like, that's a detail. It's the second biggest ball of mud, or whatever it is, or the biggest house made of twine, or whatever it is. Where I think for people like you and me, and I'm sure like all of our studious listeners, that's where it's fun to be a lifelong learner, because you're always like the idea that we're going to die and not have seen all four corners of the world and explored every bit of history. It's like we have to pick and choose what we want to learn about too, right? Like what histories we want to learn about too. And that's the part where I think, if you had unlimited money and unlimited time, right, that's all I would want to do is travel and learn about all of these different places. And then also, when I've been to Spain enough times now too, I love Sevilla, I love Madrid. Now I'll take a bus 15, 20 minutes outside of the downtown because I want to see what the neighborhoods are like, right? And it's like, oh, the only reason I do that is because I've been to Sevilla 6 or 7 times, right? Like I've seen all this stuff downtown. So I want to see what it's like in other areas, right? And get to know the histories of those places and when they came around. And was this a little town that was gobbled up by the expansion, or was this something that was part of a, government expansion project or whatever? So yeah, so that's all just kind of repeating the same kinds of things, in which every environment, your mileage will vary. If you've never been to Paris before, well, yes, go see the Eiffel Tower, and then the Louvre and all those kind of things. But then once you get that out of your system, then start thinking about the lesser known points of history and see where you can find those, because they all exist and they're all existing sort of simultaneously. Sometimes you got to look a little harder, but no, that's the joy of being an educated, curious person, I think.
And I think if you're somebody who enjoys discovery, if you have curiosity, if you're somebody who wants to interrogate some of these things, I look at a board game like Mansions of Madness, which is designed to uncover a mystery, right? And you are gradually building out this mansion's floor plan based on the mystery that you're solving for that particular mission. I think that ends up being a worthwhile endeavor to do multiple times, because you can have the same mystery unfold differently in different
ways, yeah.
ways. And real world exploration, understanding history, digging into culture, all of that is the same thing. It's its own game with its own rules and parameters,
Yep.
but something like Mansions of Madness just happens to be more structured than you going and finding some historical site near Madrid, or diving into what those neighborhoods are like.
Right.
In the same way that, like, I love being in New England because I can do that. I can go for a
Yep.
walk in the woods and stumble upon a stone building that turns out was used by the Leatherman, right?
Yeah.
And there are all these interesting little quirks. One of the reasons why I've been loving the show Widow's Bay is because it does a nice job of threading together the sort of folklore of old New England stories with that temporal spatial framework that we're talking about, where you can look at, here's what happened hundreds of years ago, here's what the present is like, here's the connective tissue between those two things, and here's how people in the present view the same situation as people in the past may or may not have. And there are just all of these different ways that you can interpret, and I think that's the part that's fun for me, is the interpret or the inference from the environment that I can then use as the fuel for my own story that I want to tell about my exploration of that thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we're getting toward the end here, just to put a bow on what we've been discussing, I had mentioned this in a previous episode, but one of the projects I worked on at the University of Connecticut was called Courtroom 600, or Nuremberg. And the idea was to help learners in a museum context understand the Nuremberg tribunals that took place after World War II, not explicitly about the Holocaust, but how did different kinds of people experience the events of World War II? What were their perspectives and why? And all of that was grounded in the physical evidence of the time, or the artifacts of the time. And when we're talking about space and time and how environmental storytelling can help people understand, I think back to an experience I had in preparation of developing Courtroom 600, in which my colleagues and I visited the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And in addition to being just sort of a fascinating place that everybody should go visit for their own education, it's just a really impressive museum space. One of the coolest projects we get to see while we were there, while we were working with the curator of the museum, was this virtual reality project where you stood in one of the alleys behind an apartment complex in Warsaw, in one of the ghettos. And it was so moving because of the fact that the VR scenario was set immediately after the ghettos had been purged. So all of the windows are broken and you can see the curtains sort of flapping in the wind. And then it plays on top of this visual that is before you, a poem read by one of the survivors who their ancestor was part of that purge. And so you're standing there taking in the visuals, the auditory. It's something about embodying being present in that space that makes you feel more like you understand what it could or would have been like for somebody who lived through it themselves. That left a major impact on me, or it left a major mark on me, because as much as I've been to museums and learned through the sort of exposition that comes with going and looking at an exhibit, that's one thing. It's a completely different thing to be a person who has been, and I'm putting that in air quotes here, but been in those environments at those times in ways that, in your day-to-day life, you're so far removed from, you don't really think about that way. But once you're present in it, it completely changes your attitude, and you are much more likely to empathize with the people who were present for whatever happened. It's the same reason why, as you were mentioning about the Berlin Wall, that you can still go and visit the internment and concentration and death camps that are present in Europe from World War II, because people don't want you to forget what it was like for somebody to be in that space. And by forcing people to inhabit that mindset, it gets them to empathize, sympathize, and then also be able to act on the world in a way that gets them closer to something approaching justice and reconciliation, as opposed to allowing it to slip out of living memory and go into the same realm as all those other things that have just sort of been forgotten.
Yeah, and it reminds me too that, again, back to, going to Europe or going anywhere, but my memories, of having gone with students a number of times to the Mesquita, the mosque cathedral in Cordoba. And I say, before we go in there, imagine being, it's July, it's 100 degrees, it's sweaty, it's whatever, and you move from outdoors and then into this sacred space, right, that is dark, it is cool, it is quiet, right? And it's like, and it's amazing on the inside. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you believe all these people? Or they're telling you all these stories, Like, it is absolutely dramatic. It's dramatic today. And imagine doing that in the 11th century or whatever, right? Like, where you don't have the internet, you don't have, anything that we would think of these modern conveniences, but this movement from one space into another, and just the sight and the sound and the smell. All those things are good. That's what I always bring into creative writing, is you bring it, not just me, but anybody who teaches, you're always going for that imagery that's based on the five senses. And I think that that's something that, we probably talk about in the same thing with environmental storytelling. If, you're doing a film or writing a novel or making a game, you can't taste anything, you can't smell anything really. You can see and you can hear in those media, but when you're physically there, right, then you can get it's always fun too when you're in Sevilla and you're coming around these little, the Jewish quarter, you come around and there's like a square that is shady and it smells like oranges because all the orange trees are there, right? And it's like, you can't look at a book and recognize I was hot and now I found this cool little oasis that smells heavenly, right? Just imagine what that would have been like in the Middle Ages, right? To come across, and it's like you were just saying, if you're physically there, then you can experience it in a way that if you're watching, Rick Steves or a cameraman walks down the alley, it's like, oh, that's cool. But when you experience it for yourself, or, you come across and there's like this dramatic, I was talking about that with Yosemite Valley with my sons, recording, or it's talking about how the recording of some soldiers that first saw it for the first time broke down and wept because it was so unbelievably gorgeous, right? And it's like, oh, well, we've seen it, not to get into sort of the media study side of it, art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But that, it's like, oh, well, once you've seen the Mona Lisa 300 times in every textbook, does it lose something when you go see it in person? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. But
maybe this is a good place to end, is just it reminds me of the quote from Good Will Hunting where Robin Williams' character is talking to Matt Damon's character about visiting the Sistine Chapel.
So if I asked you about art, you'd probably give me the skinny on every art book ever written. Michelangelo. I know a lot about him. Life's work, political aspirations, him and the Pope, sexual orientation, the whole works, right? I bet you can't tell me what it smells like in the Sistine Chapel. You never actually stood there and looked up at that beautiful ceiling. Seen that.
And something I don't really know what it is. There's a qualia about it that washes over you when you suddenly realize. And I experience this all the time when I visit historical landmarks, and I find that it's much more intense when I visit human-centric historical landmarks versus just naturally occurring ones like the Grand Canyon, where I find myself drifting and empathizing with the hundreds or thousands of people from hundreds or thousands of years ago who were also standing in that space and breathing that air and taking in that site. When I visited Stonehenge, that's 100% how I felt. When I saw the Book of Kells for the first time, that's how I felt. You know, these spaces, something about the environments themselves tell you about your own identity and then connect it to all the identities of everyone who came before you in a way that's incredibly enriching.
Yeah, I had an experience like that. Like, we were at Gettysburg probably 4 or 5 years ago, and it was that same thing where you're like, wait a minute. The other side was right there, right? I mean, it's like, you know, within spitting distance practically. And then you know that just through the terrain, it's like, oh, well, when my commander tells me to charge, I guess I got to go charge. And I'm going to be charging over the bodies of everybody who charged yesterday. You know what I mean? It's like, it's one of those things where you're like, whoa, like you could see, they didn't have snipers that were that far range, you know, or whatever. And it's like, and again, it was like, oh, I'm already way older. You know, I probably would have been late 40s then. I'm like, oh, well, most of the people fighting in this would have been half my age, less than half my age, right? Yeah. So yeah, those kind of, and that's again a good argument for why getting out and traveling and seeing the world is way better than the goodwill hunting, just reading. And of course, doing a healthy amount of both is probably a good balance. You know, we're getting here. I think we're coming up on our allotted time. I just wanted to come back too to be like, you know, for the people who have read Collaborative World Building for Writers and Gamers and then read the World Building Workshop, or at least familiar with either one of those, you can kind of see that this idea of environmental and emergent storytelling through scope, sequence, and perspective, like how big is the space that we're talking about, what happens in the moment, and it's going to be what also relied on what happened last year and 100 years ago, or what could happen tomorrow, and then the perspective of all the different people who are moving through this space, and then you get the different social pressures that you can't see, but then you got the people, places, and things that some of them still remain, right? Some of those physical artifacts still exist. So you can see that this, you know, in terms of my sort of thinking about how do you capture world building, this whole concept of environmental and emergent storytelling, basically based on these couple essays that I read, you know, and lots more since then. But that was really sort of like a foundational, oh yeah, that's how these games work. That's how sort of life works, and moving through these historical, you know, sort of spaces work. And every space is potentially going to be a historical space, depending on whether something interesting happens there or not. So.
And we'll be the ones to determine whether something interesting happens there or not. You could be the interesting thing that happens in that space.
Yeah. That's like Plymouth Rock, where they're like, is this Plymouth Rock? It's like, it's a rock. It's in the zip code, you know what I mean? But we're gonna stick with it. Like you're the lucky rock that gets a fence put around it, right? And that's like, well, tomorrow we could just pick a different rock, but who cares?
It's the spirit of the rock that really matters. It's the narrative tied to that rock and then flung into the ocean that drags us all down with it. Yeah. Was that for a metaphor?
That sounds great. I always get happier as we talk, or grumpier. Grumpier or happier as we talk, depending on I'm happy now. I was kind of in a ho-hum mood, but now I'm thinking about environmental storytelling, and
that's just because you got to see my face. So.
That's true. And your devil lock, you got that.
I do. I have a swoop in my hair today.
Nice.
All right, dude. Thanks everybody. We'll check in with you next time, and please let other people know about the book.
That's right.
They should read it.
Keep the fan mail coming and suggestions for future episodes. You could be the first.
You could be the first.
All right, dude. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye. See you later. Bye. The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Stephen Sloda, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.